Having delivered this program many times before good-sized audiences, it was felt that it might be a good idea to put the program on television so that it could be shown in homes and at meetings throughout the country, and I'm delighted to be here to be able to do that for you. So let me begin immediately by saying that the John Birch Society subscribes to the basic thrust of the famous lament of the prophet Isaiah. He said, "My people have gone into captivity for want of knowledge." Had Isaiah's people been informed, they would have been able to stay free. And so, acting in part on the wisdom given us by this prophet, the John Birch Society is wholly and entirely an information agency, an educational institution. We seek to help Americans to be informed. We ask that the American people factor into their consciousness what we have to say, along with whatever else is said by others. We certainly do not seek a monopoly, nor do we want anyone else to have a monopoly. What we have to say, of course, is available to all, but it's not highlighted. Most of what the American people know, they learn from the headlines or from the superficial treatment of important events given by radio and television. I had a television commentator come into my office in Belmont, Massachusetts not too long ago, and he burst right in and said, here he was from television, first, fast, and superficial. And I said, that is absolutely right. I'm going to quote you all across the country. He said, fine, you go ahead and do that, but please don't use my name. What we try to do is to focus attention on the context surrounding a story, or simply raise the story from page 32 of your newspaper to the prominence it really deserves. Some important bits of information, of course, never even make it to page 32, and we try to give you those as well. When the prophet Isaiah's people woke up in slavery, there must have been many who had quickly pieced together what had happened to them. Some probably said one to another, why weren't we told? And that, of course, is the title, the thrust of my program here this evening. A similar thought came from the pen of a poet named John Greenleaf Whittier several thousand years after Isaiah. He wrote, "For all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." And a different poet, a man named Bret Harte, came shortly after Whittier, was probably thinking of what Whittier had said when he said of those words, "More sad are these we daily see, it is but hadn't ought to be." A loose interpretation of each of those two bits of poetry could easily be, why weren't we told? We're here tonight to help you from having to suffer the fate of Isaiah's people. We certainly thank you for coming. We want you to know that we can't possibly tell the entire story in a whole single evening. It is our hope to provide enough evidence, however, to start you on the path toward being a well-informed American, well-informed enough to take the kind of action that will keep all of us from going into captivity. The type of action that we recommend based on a better understanding of what is happening to our country and to ourselves is ultimately political. America needs better leaders than we have been electing. A better informed America will choose those leaders. It is our task, the one that we've chosen for ourselves, to do all that we can to bring about that better informed America. It's our hope, of course, that no American will ever have to say with final despair, why weren't we told? One of the chief underpinnings of the John Birch Society is our belief that things happen because men want them to happen. We subscribe to what has been scornfully ridiculed as the conspiratorial view of history. The opposite of such a view has to be the accidental view of history. And merely to say accidental view of history is to demonstrate its absurdity. Things do happen because of design, for good or for evil. If there is design which has an evil purpose and is wrapped in secrecy, the word conspiracy applies. But there are very few who will use it even when they know they are talking about conspiracy. Let me give you some examples of that. We can go back to the 1870s to British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who said, "The world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes." Yet he lived in what was considered to be a very open society. Approximately 50 years later, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States is reported to have said, There is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. To which we respond simply, if no one opposes evil, evil will triumph. President Wilson not only did not oppose it, he cooperated with it. Of all people, Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way." It was under his leadership, of course, that America took a great leap into socialism, which, according to Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself, had to have been planned. And finally, in a small collection of pertinent quotations, we come to a man whom we like to think would have been a John Bircher had he lived longer, our nation's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. He assessed the men in the history of his time as follows: consistency never has been a mark of stupidity. If the diplomats who have mishandled our relations with Russia were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor. James Forrestal, about to expose our nation's internal enemies in the late 1940s, was thrown out of a Bethesda Naval Hospital window. It was labeled suicide, but no one commits suicide by tying a bathrobe cord around both his neck and a radiator and jumping out the window. You merely jump out the window. I am personally convinced that James Forrestal was murdered. There's a great deal more evidence to suggest that that's the case to me. Now, what I propose to do here is to go over some of the history of the 20th century involving our nation and to talk about different things that have happened to us that if the American people had known what had happened in a particular incident, something else down the road would not have happened. In other words, had enough people said, "Why weren't we told?" and found out about it and let others know, then indeed many other things down the road would not have happened. I want to talk about the 4 wars of the 20th century involving our nation, and then some other things as well. Those 4 wars, of course, are World War I and II, and then the Korean War and the Vietnam War. World War I began in 1914. America was not involved, and there was strong sentiment in our country to keep us out of that war, which has been described, and I think accurately, as one of the most senseless wars in all history. There were people anxious, however, to get America involved in the war, including some here in our own country. People who want their nations involved in war are people who want to control their nations. War always brings consequences, even to the victor. Evil consequences such as more government and moral decline come even if you win the war. And of course, more government is something that somebody would want if indeed he wants to take control of a nation. Moral decline is something else. And so there were forces at work to get us involved in that war, but the chances of doing that, getting us involved, were very slim indeed. An incident was needed. The incident that precipitated our entry into the war turned out to be the sinking of the Lusitania. It was sunk on May 7th of 1915. A German U-boat torpedoed it off the Irish coast, and 1,200 men, women, and children were killed. The world raged at the barbarity of the Kaiser and the German people. Now, after that, the British government did something that America has later adopted, and that is to take the information about a particular incident and to seal it in a vault. The information about the Lusitania, all of the items that would have been important to know at the time, were sealed for 50 years, and America has done the same thing. We learned that from the British, I suppose. We locked up the sordid record of Martin Luther King for 50 years. After the assassination of President John Kennedy, we locked up information there for 75 years. Well, the British locked up information about the Lusitania for 50 years, which meant that it didn't become available to the public or to anyone until the late 1960s. At that point, not many people cared. But there was a British reporter, a journalist, who did. His name was Colin Simpson. And Colin Simpson dove into that information, and he eventually wrote a book published in 1972 called simply The Lusitania. What he found is the footprints of a conspiracy all over that act. He found that the Lusitania was an unstable ship, improperly designed, badly staffed, and that it was loaded with munitions. something that the British Admiralty, with high American complicity, to an extent, had actually created the situation in which that ship could be sunk. Simpson found that a report had been commissioned by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, to speculate about what might happen if a passenger ship were sunk with powerful neutrals aboard. The Lusitania, though nominally a passenger ship, was in actuality an armed auxiliary cruiser of the Royal Navy. It had been inducted into the Navy much the same as a young man in our country might be drafted into the Army. It was carrying thousands of tons of military materiel and military personnel, something that British and American dignitaries vehemently denied at the time. Excuse me. Simpson found out that World War I naval warfare was conducted according to the internationally recognized cruiser rules, under which passengers were given time to debark from their ship as long as their ship posed no direct threat to its attacker. But Winston Churchill deliberately issued inflammatory orders to his ships, instructing them to threaten at all times, and thereby deprived the passengers of any benefit under the cruiser rules. He found that the English had broken the German naval code and knew approximate locations of all German submarines operating in and around the British Isles. He found that the Germans had information that military ships would be in the Irish Sea in the first week of May when the Lusitania went by. And then he found that the British ship assigned to signal the Lusitania, escort it to safety, was suddenly and without explanation recalled, and the Lusitania, in a matter of 18 minutes, was sunk. But perhaps the most interesting of the pieces of information that he found was that the British Admiral of the Fleet, Fisher, was in contact with the German Admiral of the Fleet, von Tirpitz. These men were obviously professional military men and had known each other before their nations went to war, and amazingly, they kept up a correspondence even during the war. And 1 year after the sinking of the Lusitania, the British Admiral Fisher wrote to the German Admiral von Tirpitz, and in his letter he said, "I don't blame you for the submarine business. I'd have done exactly the same thing myself." Well, America was inflamed. Most Americans were not told that the Germans had actually taken out full-page ads in American newspapers to warn people not to go aboard the Lusitania because it was considered to be a ship of war. The activity eventually led to the United States being involved in World War I. We did go to war, and of course that was at a period when America won its wars. And we did win the war, but the results of World War I are important to consider. What were they? Initially, of course, America was involved in the affairs of Europe. We repudiated George Washington's excellent advice to beware of foreign entanglements. America began to assume the role of the world's policeman. It prepared the stage for world government. Out of World War I came the founding of the League of Nations, internationalism at the expense of sovereignty. Happily, the United States Senate said no to our entry into the League of Nations. We should be very grateful still that they did. The war, of course, consumed American lives and resources, but World War I and the whole conduct of it emboldened the conspirators. Out of World War I came the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations and the beginning of a strong drive for world government. Without getting into it too deeply, let me simply say that the Council on Foreign Relations, a private organization in New York City with about 2,400 members, has a lock grip on the United States of America, on much of what happens, on the press, on business world, on the military, on the academic world, and especially on government itself. The organization founded by a man who stated that he wanted to build socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. And it today can claim membership of the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Treasury and the head of the CIA and the head of the Federal Reserve System, and on and on and on. Now, at the end of World War I, something else happened, and that was that tremendous reparations were demanded of Germany. Germany was to be punished, made into an agrarian society. Monetary reparations were demanded of Germany, and in order to pay them, the German government inflated its currency and ultimately destroyed it. And when it destroyed the currency, of course, many of the people in Germany lost their farms and their homes and their businesses, and they became quite embittered. A man in England named David Lloyd George said at the time that what is being done is simply setting the stage for World War II. How right he was, even in the early 20s. By the end of the 20s, a new German leader had arisen named Adolf Hitler, and the people flocked to him and wanted very much to have him as a strong leader. He promised that he would restore German pride and restore that nation. And by the middle of the 1930s, Germany was again strong and began to threaten its neighbors. The world was shocked in August of 1939 when Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact and became allies. All of a sudden, all the communists in America that had been very anti-German, anti-Nazi, all of a sudden became pro-Nazi. And 1 month after that infamous non-aggression pact, in September of 1939, World War II began when Germany and the Soviet Union both invaded Poland, one from one side and one from the other. They very quickly conquered Poland, of course. And then the Soviet Union turned north to the Baltic area and took Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia. And Germany turned westward and went into the Low Countries, to Belgium and to the Netherlands and to Luxembourg, and then into France, and began to menace Britain across the Channel. In June of 1941, however, Hitler turned on the Soviet Union. Up until this time, the same forces that wanted America involved in the war in Europe were not having much success. Many of the American people said, no, we don't want to do that again. We don't want to get involved in the affairs of someone else. Let them fight it out. Let these two would-be tyrants kill each other off. There was strong movement in our country against it, and it was led by an organization called the America First Movement, one of its chief spokesmen being the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh. President Roosevelt in 1940 had even campaigned for his third term, saying that your sons are not going to have to fight in a foreign war. And he said it as, in his own terminology, again and again and again. When Hitler turned on the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the activity to get America involved in this war stepped up. The people who were so anxious to see communism continue to dominate the Soviet Union wanted very much for America to get involved to help to save communism. And so we began to participate in acts of war against against Germany. In July of 1941, for instance, the United States joined Britain in military occupation of Iceland. That's an act of war, because Britain was a combatant. U.S. destroyers began to patrol the Atlantic for the British, reporting to them on German shipping. The USS Greer, an American destroyer, was actually shot at by Nazi submarines in September of 1941. But the America First movement and the attitude to keep us out of this war was still very strong. An incident was needed, and President Roosevelt turned his attention toward Japan. He began to goad the Japanese. He froze Japanese assets in this country in July of 1941. Keep in mind, of course, that Pearl Harbor didn't come until December. He actually provoked the attack upon Pearl Harbor and even refused to warn our men that the attack was coming. And the attack did come on December 7th of 1941. Several thousand Americans were killed. 1 month after that, Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan got up in the Senate and he said, we were slated for this war by the President before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor merely precipitated what was already in the cards, he said. Well, the very next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and Germany declared war on us. And for the first year of that war, America spent all its attention, practically, on the war in Europe. We supplied the Soviet Union with tremendous amounts of equipment so that they were able to sustain their defense of their nation against the onslaught of Hitler. Hitler was turned back. The Soviet Union was saved. General MacArthur in the Pacific, anxiously seeking to carry out the mandate that he'd been given to conduct the war against Japan, begged for shipping and men and munitions, got very little, until the Soviet Union was secure. But again, here we are now in World War II, and America was winning its wars in those days. and we won this one as well. But what were the results of World War II? Well, out of World War II came the creation of the United Nations, the world government, and only 2 United States senators voted against our entry into the United Nations. Even as good an American as Senator Robert Taft of Ohio had voted for our entry and later regretted it, stated very bluntly that the UN is a trap, let's go it alone. The chief result of our being involved in the United Nations since 1945 has been that America has not had a foreign policy that puts America first. We submit everything we do to an amorphous force called world opinion. And that's not necessarily good, and it has hurt America, and it has hurt a lot of other nations as well. If a nation acts in its own self-interest, as long as it does not step on the rights of other nations, then it is doing everybody a favor, much the same as an individual who acts in his own self-interest, as long as he does not violate the rights and the prerogatives of his neighbors, will help the whole community. And so the United States found itself in the United Nations. But out of World War II came the Soviet Union becoming a world power. A great case can be made for that being the reason why it was fought. Out of World War II came foreign aid and the beginning of a situation that has given hundreds of billions of dollars of American aid to other nations. It hasn't bought us one single friend. It started out, of course, supposedly to help to stop communism. And then they started giving the foreign aid to the communists. And it continues today. That war had been fought supposedly to protect the territorial integrity of Poland and other small nations, but Poland was marked for betrayal during the war at Yalta and was handed over to the Soviet Union in 1947 along with the rest of Eastern Europe. At the close of World War II, just days before it ended, the Soviet Union was welcomed into the war in the Pacific, and because they were, at the close of the war, Russia was given domination over Manchuria, where the Japanese had stored all their arms. Of course, those arms ended up in the hands of the Chinese communists. And they were also given influence in other parts of Asia. So much so that as a result, that Korea was divided in half. And half of Korea was made the communist half, and the South Korea, of course, was the non-communist half. It was one of the half countries that have been set up by internationalists, something that has been used to great advantage by those who are trying to build their world government. In June of 1950, it was January of 1950, our Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, announced that Korea was outside the defense interests of the United States. Within 6 months, the North Korean armies accepted that invitation and invaded the South. President Truman responded by committing the meager American forces in the Far East to the defense of South Korea. But once it was started, the action was turned over to the United Nations. And it was not even called a war, it was called a police action, which meant, of course, that no declaration of war, no goal of victory. In spite of all of the restrictions that eventually were put upon our forces, led by Douglas MacArthur, the United States forces won the war and liberated all of South Korea and all of North Korea as well. And then the Chinese communists entered the war. MacArthur and his forces were not able to bomb the bridges over the Yalu, were not able to do what was necessary to conduct the war properly. MacArthur protested, was removed from his command. We slugged it out with the North Koreans who remained and the Chinese communists, the bulk of the forces, for several years, and then we cut and we ran and we lost the war in Korea. And so it's instructive to look there at what happened as a result of the war in Korea. Well, first of all, prestige for the United Nations. And then violation of the entire intent of the Constitution of the United States regarding war. War is to be declared. And if it's declared, of course, implicitly that says the goal is victory. Out of the war in Korea came legitimacy for communist China, demoralization for anti-communist forces, and especially demoralization for the U.S. military. The United States lost face in Asia, and the Korean War turned out to be a precedent for another war whose initial stages were being fought at the very same time that the Korean War wound down. That next war, of course, and let me interject here that what we're trying to say is that if much of what we're talking about had been known and known enough, the next war wouldn't have occurred. There were people who said, why weren't we told? But not enough of them. Korean War armistice occurred in 1953, and in 1953 there was a war of national liberation going on in a part of the globe called French Indochina. There were no nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. That area was a French colony. Ho Chi Minh, the communist, armed by America during World War II to supposedly fight the Japanese, was using those arms to fight against the French forces. And that whole war finally came to a culmination at a battle held at a little place called Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And the French lost. And after it was over, then there was a Geneva Convention that decided to cut that country in half. As I have said, the people who are arranging these things love the half countries. Well, the half country of North Vietnam and South Vietnam was created. The people were given a choice to live wherever they preferred, and millions of people voted with their feet and walked from their ancient homes in what was North Vietnam to the south. A wonderful testimony to the fact that freedom and liberty beat in the breast of every human being. Well, the half country was set up, and then America sent some advisors over there. They sent a man named Colonel Edward Lansdale. There was an organization founded in our country called the American Friends of Vietnam, Senator Mike Mansfield, one of its most prominent members. And these people were guiding and helping so-called South Vietnam. They actually chose the leader for that country, a man named Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a creature of our State Department, and I don't say that as a compliment. Ngo Dinh Diem's brother, named Ngo Dinh Nhu, was the head of the secret police. And Diem and his brother accomplished only one major thing in the first several years of the existence of their country. They destroyed all anti-communist forces. They destroyed the followers of the Cao Dai Pope. They destroyed a private army called the Bin Zayun. They destroyed the Ho Ha sect. And they left their nation naked. All of a sudden, as we get into the early 60s now, communist activity within South Vietnam begins. And there was even the intensity of it reached the point where Buddhist monks were pouring gasoline over their bodies, striking a match, and immolating themselves in public. And there was tremendous pressure upon the government. And Diem began to realize, I think, what was about to happen to his nation, became somewhat recalcitrant, and was himself murdered. And then the war escalated. 2 gunboats fired at a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin off the Vietnamese coast. And the Congress rushed into session and passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, committed hundreds of thousands of American forces to South Vietnam. But there was no declared war. The war was under SEATO, a creature of the United Nations. They told the men to shoot, but not till they were shot at, not to chase the enemy across the borders, not to go into his strategic hamlets. They fought the entire war in the friendly nation. And all during that war, America supplied tremendous quantities of aid and trade to Poland, Yugoslavia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, all the communist nations in Europe that transshipped much of it right to Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam to use to conduct the war against America. And after the war ended in 1973, nobody could even remember when it had begun. They said it was peace with honor in 1973, and there was no peace, and there certainly wasn't anything of honor about it. And the men who arranged it, Le Duc Tho from North Vietnam and Henry Kissinger from the United States, were given the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, what were the results of the war in Vietnam? Well, 3 nations fell to the communists, didn't they? Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And the carnage, the absolute physical brutality that has been visited on those people since is indescribable. But what about our own country? Did we get more government? Did we ever? Did we get moral decline? Yes, cynicism, drugs, pornography, the eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die attitude. We corrupted our currency, we altered our military, the political generals and admirals began to take over, members of the Council on Foreign Relations. We divided our people, we reduced patriotism. The war in Vietnam has been, I think, correctly described as a war on the American people by the American government, in addition to what happened in South Vietnam. Where are we today? Well, today we find American forces stationed practically everywhere on the globe. We have several 100,000 troops in Europe. We have troops in the Middle East. We have troops in Central America. We have troops in Japan. We have troops in Korea. We are spread out all over the globe. Who was it? Where is it in the Constitution of the United States that the people of our country should be the policemen of the world? If indeed there is an enemy, then name the enemy, and let's go and fight that enemy. What happened in Beirut, Lebanon, early in 1984, of course, certainly was a horror show. The Marines were sent there, were not given any enemy, were not even allowed to load their weapons, were required to stay at the airport in a fenced-in enclosure, even wearing combat green uniforms on a sandy beach soil. That many of them were slaughtered came as no surprise. And so the John Birch Society would like to see America begin to think about America first. And that, of course, would begin if we got out of the United Nations. But let's change subjects here completely now and talk about something that is absolutely essential to understand, and most of the American people have absolutely no understanding whatsoever about it. It's something that affects their daily lives. It's called the Federal Reserve System. We begin a discussion of that by simply pointing out that Karl Marx, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, included in it 10 planks. The 10 planks were those items that you would want to accomplish in your in a government to take over control of the country. If you were successful, you would have, in fact, established a communist state. Number 5 of those 10 planks is a central bank with a complete monopoly over the issuance of currency. And that, of course, is what we got when we got the Federal Reserve in 1913. Now, how did it come about? Well, there was strong pressure against it. The American people didn't want it. And so incidents had to be created to get it to us. We had dabbled with a central bank back in the early 1800s, and President Andrew Jackson had gotten rid of it, something we should praise him for. He also, incidentally, at one point paid off the national debt, which would make him quite unique in American history. An incident was created, that being a banking panic in 1907. It was actually precipitated by activity of J.P. Morgan and other international bankers who wanted this. They spread rumors about the insolvency of the Knickerbocker Bank and Trust Company in New York. They guided a run on it, partly to kill off the rival bank, but mostly the lesson of the panic of 1907 was clear. The United States needed a central banking system. Now, the logic of that totally escapes me. Here you have a situation where there are people who are hurt because a bank fails. And so the solution to that is that a recommendation that we have one central bank that controls the monetary value for every American. And if it fails, then everybody is hurt. So you can see why the logic of it doesn't really impress me. And nevertheless, there were people who bought that and said, yes, whatever the government is involved in can't possibly hurt. The truth of the matter is that there has never in history been honesty in the management of currency and the value of money. Well, so what happened? 1907, the panic. All of a sudden, Paul Warburg from Germany shows up in New York, working for the Kuhn-Loeb Company, promoting the concept of a national bank. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island starts the National Monetary Commission, promoting the same ideas. Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island is the maternal uncle of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. That's where the Rockefeller who is known to contemporary Americans got his name. They began promoting banking reform, they called it. They had a meeting, a lot of these people did, in Jekyll Island off the Georgia coast in late 1910, a secret meeting at which was conceived a plan to start a central bank. It was started in the United States Senate as the Aldrich Bill. It didn't get very far because Senator Aldrich was so closely tied and known to be tied to the international bankers. Also, President Taft was a strong opponent of this. But the opportunity for a change came in 1912 when President Taft had to run for re-election. The same people who wanted banking reform, they called it, the central bank, financed and guided an inflated ego in the person of Teddy Roosevelt into starting a third party. It was started as the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party as it was called. And also financed and guided by these same interests was the Democrat candidate Woodrow Wilson, who was never without that shadowy Edward Mandell House, the man who founded that Council on Foreign Relations that I talked about, the man who guided through the Congress the bill to start the Federal Reserve System. And so here we had now 3 in the race in 1912 instead of the usual 2. Had there been only 2, Taft would have easily been re-elected, but with 3 in the race, a lot of the voters became confused, and out of it, President Wilson emerged as the victor. He, of course, had attacked Taft and the bankers, but then after he was in office, his dishonesty showed when he and Aldrich and others began working extremely hard to push through the Federal Reserve Bill, which was actually passed on December 22nd of 1913. We now had it. We called it, it was a central bank, and we called it the Federal Reserve System. One of the Northeastern senators, however, Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. of Massachusetts, said with great foresight at the time that the bill as it stands seems to me to open the way to a vast inflation of the currency, he said. I do not like to think that any law can be passed which will make it possible to submerge the gold standard in a flood of irredeemable paper. How's that for foresight? He, of course, was using the definition of inflation that I use, that being that inflation is merely an increase in the quantity of currency. When you increase the quantity of currency, all currency becomes less valuable. What the effect is rising prices, when more of that currency is needed in return for goods and services. You have to define the terms. I'm always reminded of the story of the young man, to give an example of how important defining terms are. About a 5-year-old boy went to his grandfather one time and he said, "Grandpa, can you make a noise like a frog?" Well, Grandpa looked at him and said, "Yes, I can, Johnny, but why do you want me to do that?" And the boy said, "Because Daddy says if you croak, we'll be rich." Now, that's an example of what can happen if you don't define your terms. At the very same time, a congressman named Charles Lindbergh, the father of the famous aviator, he stated, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation." Well, that's what happened. You see, the new law gave the Federal Reserve the capability of expanding currency. We got a boom, contracting currency, and we get a bust. And we began on a roller coaster of alternate boom and bust. In fact, Charles Lindbergh also said, from now on, depressions will be scientifically created. And they were, including the Great Depression of 1929, because during the 20s, the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply dramatically. And an awful lot of people found that all you needed to do was to get yourself in debt and hock everything you had, and then all of a sudden you could buy into the stock market and you could become a millionaire overnight. It was the roaring 20s. Everybody was getting rich. And when everything was ready, the New York financiers started calling 24-hour broker call loans. This meant that stockbrokers and their customers had to dump their stock on the market in order to pay the loans. It naturally collapsed the stock market and brought about a banking collapse all over the country. To think that the scientifically engineered crash of 1929 was an accident or the result of stupidity defies logic. It certainly was not a failure of the free enterprise system. It was an example of what could happen when you get away from the free enterprise system. Congressman Louis McFadden, later the chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, later commented, "The Depression was not accidental," he said. "It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all." That's exactly what it was. Now let me show you, if I can for a few minutes, what has happened to America's currency. You see here we have 5 pictures of United States currency. The first of them, of course, a little bit larger proportionately than the others, and it was, in actuality. The first of them is a gold certificate. This particular one that I have is dated 1922. And it's a U.S. Treasury note. It says right at the top of it, this certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury of the United States of America $10 in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand. The finest paper money that the world has ever known. Bar none. You could take that piece of paper down to the U.S. Treasury or to any bank in the United States and exchange it for a piece of gold. And it's gone. And so is the gold. We go to the next one. The next one is a silver certificate, again, a U.S. Treasury note. And this one is dated, I think, 1957. It says on it, this certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury of the United States of America $1 in silver, payable to the bearer on demand. And for that, you could get a silver dollar. You could get 2 halves, 4 quarters, and so on. Again, very good money. And that, of course, is gone also. The first of these two are the U.S. Treasury notes. The next one is the beginning of Federal Reserve notes. And the first Federal Reserve notes came out at a time when gold certificates were still in circulation. And this first Federal Reserve note, which is dated 1926, says on it, up in the upper left-hand corner here, it says redeemable in gold on demand. It was circulating at a time when this was interchangeable with the gold certificate that we've already talked about, and so gold could be had for it until 1933 when President Roosevelt took us off the gold standard and then asked the American people to turn in their gold, and they did. So the next Federal Reserve note that we went to is the one that says redeemable in lawful money. And therein hangs quite a tale, because in 1970, a U.S. attorney went into a bank in California with a $50 Federal Reserve note that said redeemable in lawful money, and he presented it to the teller and he asked for some lawful money. And the girl said, do you want 2 20s and a 10, or do you want 5 10s, or what is it you want, sir? No, he said, miss, if you look on those pieces of currency that you have there, you'll find that they also say redeemable in lawful money. And if they're redeemable in lawful money, they can't be lawful money. I'd like some lawful money. Well, they took him downstairs to the vault. They met the president of the bank and so forth. They offered him any combination of bills adding up to 50, and then they offered him the sandwich coins that we now use, the base metal coins that are no longer precious metal, gold or silver. And he finally took out a little copy of the Constitution of the United States from his pocket, and he pointed to the part where it says gold and silver. And he asked if he was going to get any of that, and they said no. He said, thank you, give me back my 50, and he went out the door. Of course, he knew exactly what was going to happen. And so the Federal Reserve then came out with the final in the panorama that we have here, which says simply, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, redeemable in nothing. And in 50 years, the United States has gone from the finest paper money that the world has ever known to totally irredeemable paper. Ladies and gentlemen, the value of that paper is dependent on how much of it is in circulation. And the limitation on its amount of circulation has always been the national debt. That's not any limitation at all anymore, because Congress continually raises the national debt. The Federal Reserve is given authorization to put currency into circulation based on what debt they hold. In 1980, the situation became far worse when the Congress passed the Monetary Control Act, which empowers the Federal Reserve to issue currency based not only on United States government debt, but on foreign debt as well. And what it ultimately means is that the American people are paying for everything. And we are being brought down to the level of every other nation prior to being merged, if these people have their way, into a one-world system controlled by them. But let's change completely now and talk about something else in the nature of why weren't we told. On October 4th of 1957, the American people were brought to a sudden awareness of the fact that the Soviet Union was a technological superior of ours, and that they were militarily greater and educationally superior and so forth. The incident was Sputnik. And you can see here the New York Times the very next day. Soviet fires Earth's satellite into space. It's circling the globe at 18,000 miles per hour. It was a shock to the American people to find out that the Soviet Union was able to do this. Well, as chance would have it, there were a couple of reports already prepared to issue about what the American people, the American government should do to combat Soviet technological greatness. One was the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. It had been written for them by a young Rockefeller employee named Henry Kissinger. Another was the Gaither Report, put out by a man named Rowan Gaither. What those two reports actually recommended, though not explicitly, was that the way to combat the Soviet Union was to socialize the United States. Never, of course, was it said that you don't fight the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics by yourself becoming a socialist nation. But America started on that course. Expanded spending in government, increased taxation, the beginnings of inflation, socialistic controls over business and industry, federal aid to and control over education. And there's an interesting story there, because when the federal government got involved in the educational process, the level of educational excellence was at about here. Billions of dollars were poured in, and directly proportional to the billions of dollars poured in, the slide of educational excellence began. The way to solve the problem of declining education in the United States is to get the federal government out of it. And people who recommend 12, 15 more billion dollars as a crash program in education, in my view, obviously hate children. Now, what about the story of Sputnik in the nature of why weren't we told? I have here a newspaper clipping about a speech given by General James M. Gavin. James M. Gavin, as a general in the United States Army, was the commandant at the United States missile installation at Huntsville, Alabama, during the period that Sputnik was launched. He was the commanding officer. He made a speech in Boston in December of 1966. The clipping I have, however, comes out of a Denver newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News. You can possibly see the headline says, "Superiors blocked early space test, General declares." General Gavin went on to talk about the fact that they had the plans, the technology, the equipment, the knowledge, everything that they needed to put a satellite into space and to beat the Russians for an entire year prior to Sputnik. He said, "On the basis of our information, I made several entreaties to the Department of Defense seeking authority to launch a satellite, and shortly thereafter I was given a written order forbidding me to do so, and this admonition was passed on to Wernher von Braun." The United States could have beaten the Soviet Union, and if we had beaten the Soviet Union, all of those consequences that I talked about, the beginnings of socialism in the United States, would not have had any justification or supposed justification. I made this talk some months ago down in the state of Florida, and a man jumped up out of the audience right at the time, and I couldn't restrain him. He couldn't restrain himself. And he said, "You're right, you're absolutely right." He said, "I was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force at the time, on loan to the Army. We knew that we could put a satellite in orbit. We were terribly frustrated. We were so frustrated, in fact," he said, "that we went to the Navy and we said, you take our plans, our parts, our technology, everything we have, and you go ahead and put the satellite in orbit and beat the Soviet Union and take the credit." And he added, he said, "You can imagine how frustrated we were when we were willing to let the Navy have credit for something." I have met others also who were there at the time. The simple fact of the matter is that forces within our own government kept us from being first in space, and the activity that occurred after Sputnik is what they were seeking. Now, something else. The United States government has been the chief supplier of the Soviet Union. Members of the John Birch Society have been saying this and saying it for a long, long time. In 1972, a tremendous work was published. A man named Anthony Sutton, who had spent several years of his life researching the subject, published with the Hoover Institute at Stanford University his 3-volume work called Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. He summarized his own findings, did Anthony Sutton, before the Republican National Convention in Miami, Florida in 1972. He said this: "There is no such thing as Soviet technology. Almost all, perhaps 90 to 95%, came directly or indirectly from the United States and its allies. In effect, the United States has built the Soviet Union, its industrial and military capabilities. This massive construction job has taken 50 years. And ladies and gentlemen, that is still going on. Right now, America is being menaced with missiles from the Soviet Union that are guided by IBM and controlled data computers. The Soviet Union has a capability of MIRVing their missiles, and that means putting more than one warhead on the top of a single missile. It cannot be done without sophisticated miniaturization capability. The microchips, the sophisticated ball bearings that they use to do that came from the United States. And on we go. We find that the United States taxpayers were forced to pay for the construction of a truck factory in the Soviet Union with loans to the Soviet Union's government from the Export-Import Bank in Washington, D.C. And those trucks started coming off the assembly lines in 1979, and the first of them were used to invade Afghanistan. On we go. So let's go back to where we began. We contend that there is a conspiracy. And as I began, I made quotations of many individuals who have said the very same thing that a John Bircher could say today, but wouldn't use the word conspiracy. Benjamin Disraeli said the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. John Bircher could say that today. President Wilson said, there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Certainly a John Bircher could say that. Franklin Roosevelt said, in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. Indeed, we could say that. And of course, James Forrestal. If the diplomats who have mishandled our relations with the Soviet Union were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor. Well, we agree there as well. And so I hope that you can see that our conclusion about conspiracy is far from ridiculous. We believe that a conspiracy exists and that its purpose, simply put, is to rule the world. Far from being controlled by communists, it controls communism and has done so at least since the days when its top agents, who were not called communists, financed and employed a detestable political hack named Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto. That work is nothing more than a plan to follow in order to seize power in a nation. Marx was such an insignificant creature that his name did not even appear on the Communist Manifesto for the first 20 years of its existence. The conspiracy that we're talking about involves men from the top political, educational, financial, and social circles of Europe and our country. It has now drawn within its various levels of power and influence similarly placed leaders from all continents. The ultimate goal of the conspiracy is world government. And these individuals know that wealth and position bring accompanying power, but they also know something that most Americans have never considered, and that is that absolute power comes politically and only politically, which is why they gravitate to governments. They work tirelessly to achieve power in governments while they simultaneously work to transfer each nation's sovereignty to a one-world government which they intend to run and with which they intend to rule everyone. The chief tactics used by the conspiracy have always been war and money and hatred. We have discussed America's wars of the 20th century. By the time each had ended, a small number of Americans had learned of the treachery and the conspiracy involved in getting us into each and even in conducting the wars. They lamented our dead, certainly, and the damage that had been done to our country. Had there been more who knew what had really taken place, the next war might have been averted. And so, too, had there been enough who knew, could our plunge into socialism have been averted? Our covering of our eyes to communism, our transfer of the nation's money power to an elite few, and so much more. But in each of these cases, only a few people knew. And those who did went to others and tried to sound the alarm. A few more in each case responded with the justifiable indignation that we seek in every human being. And they said, why weren't we told? But unfortunately, most could not be bothered. We earnestly hope today that a great many Americans, a great many more Americans will be bothered and will get involved in the struggle for freedom. Freedom for ourselves and independence for our country. Either many more of the American people are going to be involved and soon, or the goals of this conspiracy will be accomplished, and there will be a one-world tyranny administered just as much in a tyrannical fashion as any communist state. Ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time. We do not have an infinite amount of time. And so we ask you to stay put and to listen to the second part of our talk, which is how to solve these problems, what to do about them. We're going to talk about the John Birch Society. We're going to talk about its inception, the man who founded it, who he was, and how he got the idea to found it, and the stimulus, and about some false starts that he took in the political world, and some advice that he got from world leaders, and how the John Birch Society began, and how it was smeared, and how it became very much an untouchable amongst many of the American people, and where we are today. I think you'll find it very interesting. I think you'll find it very stimulating, and I certainly know you'll find that the message is full of hope, because there is great hope. There is great hope that we can save our country, and that we can turn this world gone crazy back to sanity once again. There are many pieces of literature that I'd like to recommend. I'm not going to recommend a tremendous amount, but I will recommend two things now and then several books that we'll talk about during the second part when we talk about the John Birch Society. Let me mention first of all that we've alluded several times here to the power of the United Nations and the damage that it does to our country. A very important book was written by a man named Robert Lee, called The United Nations Conspiracy. This book is extremely valuable, and we certainly hope that many of you will avail yourself of the opportunity to get a copy and to read it, and then to share it with as many Americans as you possibly can, especially young Americans who, while they're in school, are being told that the United Nations is the savior of mankind. It is just the opposite. Now, we have, of course, talked about the fact that our government is, or we've alluded to the fact that our government is controlled by a powerful few behind the scenes. And I've written a little book myself to discuss that subject, a little book called The Insiders, a look at the powerful few who really dictate America's policies. And this little book discusses in detail the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, and it even gives the membership list of both as published by those organizations themselves. Read the book and you'll get an appreciation of what we say when we say that the insiders above the communists are the ones who are really in control, and our little book here will help you to understand that. And so we hope you get a chance to buy that and to read through that as well. We will break now, and then we'll come back in a short time to discuss the John Birch Society. Having given this talk before many, many audiences, some quite large, it was determined that it might be a good idea to put it on television, and so we're here in a studio tonight to give the talk so that it could be used more across the country. And what we want to talk about, of course, is the John Birch Society. Where did it come from? Who is this Robert Welch who started it? Who is John Birch? So we have a lot of ground to cover, and let's plunge right ahead and say that Robert Welch, the man who founded the John Birch Society, was born on December 1st of 1899 in a little farm area in eastern North Carolina. He is, therefore, 1 month older than the 20th century, and I've heard him many times say that, therefore, it should listen to me. And, of course, it never did to the extent that he would have preferred or that I would have preferred either. He was early recognized as somewhat of a prodigy by his own family. His mother began to teach him to read when he was 2. She started teaching him Latin and algebra when he was 5. When he was 7, he read a 9-volume history of the world and asked for more. He went on to high school and graduated at age 12, and then to the University of North Carolina, graduating at age 16. From there, he went to the Naval Academy, and in 2 years, he piled up one of the best records in the history of the Academy. But World War I had ended then, and he decided against a naval career, so he left the Naval Academy after 2 years, honorably resigned, and decided at that point to study law. Friends immediately told him, if indeed you're going to study law, you should go to the finest law school that the world has, and that would be Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Well, that's what brought him to Massachusetts. While at Harvard Law School, in fact, in his 3rd year, he tangled with Professor Felix Frankfurter, then a professor of law at the university, later, of course, a very important and dangerous Supreme Court justice. Felix Frankfurter was teaching a course at the time in labor relations. And he was prefacing all his remarks by discussing the irreconcilable conflicts that existed between labor and management, and that therefore there had to be a lot of laws passed and so forth. Well, Robert Welch knew that that was not so. And he challenged the professor. He said, labor and management aren't enemies. They are 2 arms of the same body called productivity. And to continually to insist that they are indeed enemies is to invite them to become enemies, and to invite upon America the problems that are already besetting European nations where there were labor problems and labor unrest. And he challenged the professor, but he was the student, and of course the professor was the professor, and the student lost. And Robert Welch walked out of Harvard Law School in his 3rd year and never returned. He never did get a law degree. And at that point in his life, he decided that he wanted to be a producer. He actually took a survey. He wanted to become a manufacturer, and his criteria to find a good product to produce included the requirement that that product be something of a consumable. He didn't want it to be a very large item that you'd buy and then have for a lifetime. He wanted it to be something that you'd buy and consume so that you'd buy another, and that you'd tell others, and that they'd buy others, and so forth. Well, his little survey turned up that a good product to produce, to fit his criteria, would be candy bars. So he started a candy company. In later years, his younger brother James moved up from North Carolina. They teamed up together and they built the James O. Welch Candy Company out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I dare say everyone who's hearing this program has been affected to some degree by the Welch Candy Company, because if you've ever eaten one of the Welch fudge bars or the Welch coconut bars or a sugar daddy or a sugar baby, you indeed have been affected by the Welch Candy Company. Robert Welch, in fact, the man who founded the John Birch Society, also invented the sugar daddy. Now, I always like to tell people that they should remember that, because someday it might win them $1 million on a quiz show. And I know that he's quite proud of having invented the sugar daddy, because it is a good product, and I certainly know the dentists love it. Well, James O. Welch and Robert Welch set about to build their company. They put out good products. James the president, Robert the vice president for sales and advertising. And Robert began to travel the country, and wherever he went, he'd get to meet new friends, and he'd always impress his new friends with his knowledge of current events and his study of history and his tremendous love for America. That was the thing that motivated him so much. When the 30s began, of course, they were very busy. The Roosevelt administration took office, and Robert Welch saw the beginning of a leap into socialism under the Roosevelt administration. He was terribly dismayed at what he saw. So much so that very shortly after Roosevelt had taken office and begun all of the alphabet agencies and all of the socialistic drive, Robert Welch wrote an essay called "A Weight on My Shoulders." And to give you an idea of his concerns, even as far back as the time of the century when I was born in the middle 30s, Robert Welch said this: "The glory that is passing in America that I was born in, that was given me by courageous and far-seeing men, many of whom died for that purpose, that I grew up in, went to school in, and loved more every year as I came to understand what a miraculous achievement it was as compared with any other social group at any place or any time in the history of this world. My America," he said, "is being made over into a carbon copy of thousands of despotisms that have gone before." You can see his concern. His concerns mounted because a lot of the socialism that the Roosevelt administration had begun was not done away with. It was in fact increased. Even though, of course, the Supreme Court slapped down a few of those agencies, what had happened is that our country had gone out to the left, all the way out to here, come back a little bit, and then regained what it had lost and continued on into the left. Robert Welch became so concerned that around 1940 he decided to take pen in hand again and to write a book about the Roosevelt administration. He decided to use the powerful weapon of satire. He wrote a little book called The Ant Colony. And of course, you can imagine the satire about ants and the bureaucracy. Now, as he has always done, he wrote out everything that he's ever written in longhand, and so he had to hire a young man to help him to type the manuscript, to do a little editing, and also to send the first chapters as they prepared them off to a few publishers to see if there was any interest about the book. Well, there was interest. Several publishers immediately wanted that book. Robert Welch was sitting at home one day on a Sunday afternoon, and the phone rang at his home, and it was his young friend who said, "Mr. Welch, we have to do away with the project. We can't publish the book." And Mr. Welch said, "Why? Well, what are you talking about?" "Oh," he said, you haven't been listening to your radio. You don't know that the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor, and our nation is going to be at war. We certainly can't publish a book critical of the president while our nation is at war." Robert Welch said, "Well, boy, you're absolutely right about that." So the Ant Colony was put up on a shelf, and it never was published. It's one of many manuscripts that we have that Robert Welch has written and has not been published. And one of the manuscripts that he did well before he started the John Birch Society is something that was published, and I personally had a little bit of a hand in that because I was having a discussion with Robert Welch. He obviously called me to his office, as he so frequently did, sometimes to chew me out for something that I deserved, sometimes to give me a new assignment or to explain something that he wanted me to understand. And I used to delight in those meetings, just the two of us, because you could always count on Robert Welch to go off on a tangent and to discuss something that was really interesting. Well, on this particular occasion, he did go off on a tangent, and I don't know exactly what it was. I don't remember. But I remember a comment that I made to him afterwards. I said, "Of course, Mr. Welch," I said, "knowledge is the discovery of ignorance." And he looked at me and he said, "What did you say?" So I repeated it. I said, "Knowledge is the discovery of ignorance." He wrote it down on his little pad, and he looked at it for a minute, and then he looked up at me and he said, "You know, I wrote a book about education one time, and it took me a whole book to say what you've said in 6 words. Well, I kind of gulped. He said, "You might enjoy reading that." I said, "Yes, sir, I think I might." He said, "Well, it's called The Romance of Education, and I have it up there on the shelf. If you'd like to borrow it sometime, let me know." So I said, "Well, how about right now?" He let me borrow it, The Romance of Education. I took it home and I read it, and I just thrilled with it. I thought it was one of the greatest studies of the subject of education that I had ever read. And I asked him if I could share it with some of my colleagues working for the John Birch Society, and they read it as well. And amongst us all, we finally decided to beg him to publish this book. And so he did, finally. He published The Romance of Education, and this book is a tremendous study of the subject of education. It's a tribute to liberal education. It's a tribute to what education should be, in fact. And in here you'll find a chapter about the education in mathematics, education in language, education in poetry, in history, and so forth. And it is a measure of the man, Robert Welch, that you don't get from reading the books that he's written about the subjects of communism and the problems of our government and our activities, our government's activities. And so we wanted this published because this gives an impression of Robert Welch far beyond what could be called polemical arguments that he has used, although we certainly don't shrink from any of those. Well, he eventually did agree to publish the book, and I recommend it to anybody who is interested in education. And in it you'll probably find something that you might disagree with, as I did, but that doesn't matter. I don't expect that there's any man alive that I agree totally with, nor do I expect that you will. So Robert Welch and his brother pitched in to help the war effort, and they did what they could. The company retrenched to a degree, as most companies did, and after the war was over, they were again able to function after not having been able to get chocolate and coconut and some of the ingredients for some of their candy bars. After World War II ended, an awful lot of people went back to business as usual, as they should have. The war was over, and the turmoil and the losses that had occurred, we could somewhat put them behind us. But Robert Welch noticed that a lot of the socialism that comes to a nation during a war, the more government and moral decline that you always get during warfare, was not being removed. And he said to himself, America is going into socialism, and this is bad, and he wanted to study more about it. So he went to England in the immediate post-World War II years to study socialism. He knew that England was farther down that road towards socialist tyranny, and so he wanted to study it. And it was while he was in England, immediately after World War II, that Robert Welch discovered a conspiracy. He found that what was happening to England was not happening by chance, and that there were powerful influences, individuals within that country, anxiously working to bring socialism to England, because they knew that socialism would mean a few people on top and everybody else doing their will. He came back to America, and he saw the very same organizations in America that had been started in England, traceable to British Fabian socialism. And so his concerns continued to mount. This, of course, was the period when nation after nation was now falling to communism, all of Eastern Europe and then China. And of course, Alger Hiss had been found out to be a communist agent in 1949, the man who was the chief American delegate to the founding of the United Nations, the man who hired several hundred of the first employees for America at the United Nations, was found out to have been a communist agent. So Robert Welch's concerns continued to mount. So much so that by 1950 he decided to offer himself for political office. He said that if he was able to gain a political base, then more people would listen to what he had to say. So he chose to run for lieutenant governor of Massachusetts in 1950. Now, he had to get the nomination first, and so he ran as a potential nominee of the Republican Party in Massachusetts. And he conducted quite an unusual campaign, even for Massachusetts. His campaign was very low on bumper stickers and bugles and hats and bands, and it was very high on education. Get the people in front of Robert Welch, and he would tell them about the wonders of America and about the threats that were facing it. Well, he conducted that campaign, and he surprised a lot of people with the amount of energy he put into it and the amount of following he did attract. But when they counted the votes on primary day, Robert Welch came in second, which meant, of course, when you come in second in a political campaign, you are totally defeated. And Robert Welch was totally defeated in the purely political. He then assessed the campaign, and he realized that a lot of the people who were brought to hear him didn't understand what he was talking about, didn't understand about the uniqueness of America and about the threats from within that he was then talking about. So his concerns continued to mount. In 1952, he again got involved in the purely political, this time trying to get Robert Taft nominated for President of the United States by the Republican Party. Robert Taft, of course, was known at the time as Mr. Republican. He'd a powerful United States senator, a wonderful American, a man who, if he had been nominated, certainly would have been president, because whoever the Republicans nominated in 1952 was going to win. That was pretty much a foregone conclusion. And Robert Taft had worked his way up the chairs, and Robert Welch had met him and talked to him and knew him and was very anxious to have him. And so he got involved in the Taft for President campaign and helped to raise money for him and made speeches in his behalf and so forth. Well, the Eastern establishment Republicans didn't want Taft. And so they dragged an old Democrat out of mothballs and put the Republican mantle over him and ran him against Taft, a man named Dwight David Eisenhower. And then was visited upon the American people some of the dirtiest political shenanigans in all of our nation's history. The entire California delegation was stolen from Taft and given to Eisenhower. The man who accomplished it was Earl Warren, who was later rewarded by being made the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, something that we are still paying for today. The Texas delegation was stolen. Individual delegates from other parts of the country were pressured, and some of them talked about it eventually, about social pressure and business pressure and all kinds of pressure, vicious type activity used to force them to vote for Eisenhower rather than Taft. Well, when the votes were counted, Eisenhower won the nomination and Taft was defeated. And so was Robert Welch, once again, in the purely political. And at that point in his life, he washed his hands totally of political activity, and he said what is needed is more awareness. He said that if more people had been aware, he might very well be then the Republican lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. If more people had been aware, Robert Taft would be president of the United States. And so he decided to turn his attention towards educational type activities. During 1952, he was giving a speech called Atchison and MacArthur. And his speech dwelled on America's activity in the Far East. It dwelled on the sellout of China to the communists under Mao Zedong. It dwelled on what was happening in Korea and predicted a loss of the war in Korea. And there were people who heard him give that speech who asked for a copy of it so that they could study it. There were no copies available. He was finally persuaded to put it in manuscript form and to publish it. The Henry Regnery Company in Chicago published it. The speech was called "May God Forgive Us." And this is an early edition, not the first edition. But it was "May God forgive us for forcing China into the communists' hands, for losing the Korean War, and for firing General MacArthur." Now that book is still available. We have published it again in a volume that contains the entire "May God Forgive Us" in the volume now called "Again May God Forgive Us," that has that entire book and several others as well. And so that is available for anybody who wants to read it today, and it's certainly well worth reading even today. Well, there were about 200,000 copies of that little book that were sold and bought and distributed, and a lot of the people who read it wrote back to Robert Welch or to the publisher and said, "This is tremendous. This is information that we need. So please keep it up. Please keep telling us what we need to know." And where Robert Welch had been discouraged, he was now becoming encouraged. And of course, at that time, he had come across the name of John Birch, the man for whom our society is named. John Birch was a young Christian missionary who had gone from the state of Georgia to China in 1940 to work for his religion. And John Birch, during that period, had lived amongst the Chinese, had been able to exist on their diet, and had become quite revered by the Chinese people. When World War II broke out, John Birch eventually volunteered for service with the American forces. He wanted to be a chaplain, and General Claire Chennault of the famous Flying Tiger organization didn't want chaplains as much as he needed intelligence operatives. He already had some chaplains. So he asked John to accept a commission, and he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the United States Army Air Corps. And he spent the entire war effort behind the Japanese lines, working and living amongst the Chinese people, and building airfields, and rescuing downed pilots, and reporting on troop movements and other things, and becoming a tremendous leader. John Birch's attributes were many, but probably the most important was his leadership ability of other men. He served with distinction. He was decorated. He rose to the rank of captain. And after the war was over, within 10 days, John Birch was sent on a mission by his superiors to go up this railroad and to find out if those people up there, the Chinese leaders, were friend or foe. They, of course, were the Chinese communists. And John approached them, and during that meeting, he was murdered in cold blood, and so were his companions, except that one of them was given up for dead and was not dead, and was later rescued, and came out and told what had happened to John Birch and the others. Well, John Birch's family tried to find out what had happened to their son, and our State Department was keeping the information about his death from anyone, because they didn't want the American people to know that the Chinese communists really were enemies of America. The attitude being conveyed then, of course, was that the Chinese communists were agrarian reformers. Well, Robert Welsh heard about this young man and then went down to Georgia to visit the parents of John Birch. He got information about him from Senator William Noland of California and a few other sources. And in 1954, he wrote this book, The Life of John Birch. And again, published by the Henry Regnery Company. Again, about 200,000 copies. This, of course, again, is an early edition of the book, not the original. A lot of people who read that book wrote back to Robert Welsh and said, tremendous, keep it going, keep telling us what we need to know. Nobody else seems to be doing it. That book, of course, is available today. We do have a current edition. It's called The Life of John Birch again, and there you can see a photograph of General Claire Chennault pinning a medal on John Birch, one of the most unique Americans of our time or any time. Well, Robert Welsh again was encouraged because there were people who were reading his books. But he was still the vice president of sales and advertising for a nationwide candy concern. And he was involved with the American Candy Makers Association, and he was a regional vice president of the National Association of Manufacturers. And he had a family and 2 sons, and he was a very busy man. But in 1956, he found time to start a little magazine called One Man's Opinion. This is Volume 1, Number 1, February 1956. And he sent it to many of the people whose names he'd gathered over the years. And he asked them to subscribe, and he told them, if you subscribe for 5 issues, you'll get 5, but I can't promise you when. It was to be an occasional publication. If you want 10, you'll get 10, and I can't promise you when you'll get those either. Well, in 1957, Robert Welsh decided to leave all of his business responsibilities and most of his income to spend the rest of his life fighting against what he saw to be an entrenched evil within our own country. Early in 1958, he got some other people to help him with the magazine, and they changed the name of it from One Man's Opinion to American Opinion. This is the first edition, February 1958. And this actually predates the John Birch Society by almost a year. Well, it was at this point also, now that he'd separated himself from the candy company, that he decided to go and to pick the brains of others in the world who were knowledgeable anti-communists. He went to Taiwan and he visited with Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek had come to know of Robert Welsh because his 2 early books both had to do with the subject of China. And they were actually translated into Chinese, and a lot of people read them over there. And they greatly revered Robert Welsh. And so Chiang Kai-shek gave him a lot of time, listened to what he had to say as Robert Welsh discussed the formation of an educational institution. Chiang Kai-shek was very, very encouraging. Said that's exactly needed in your country, and it's needed in any country. And then Robert Welsh went to Germany to visit Konrad Adenauer, the great leader of Germany, one of the greatest men of the 20th century, incidentally, a man so revered by the German people that they called him Der Alte, the Old One. Adenauer gave Robert Welsh far more time than he had suspected he'd get. He listened intently, and And then he made a comment that was especially perceptive. He said, "Mr. Welsh, what you're planning is important, and I wish you great success. But I must tell you of my fears that I don't think it could succeed in the United States. And the reason I feel that way is because of the religious differences of the people in your country. I believe that those differences will eventually tear your endeavor to shreds." Robert Welsh made a mental note of that. And when he formed the John Birch Society, he wrote into the founding of it and many times has encouraged us over the years not to let the religious differences that we have tear us apart, but also never to sacrifice any of our own beliefs while we work in concert with others towards solving a very important problem that faces every one of us. And so we thank Konrad Adenauer for pointing that out to Robert Welsh. He was right about it. And over the years, those of us who've been members of the Society for any length of time would know that occasionally this does crop up as a little problem like this. And because we've been forewarned and we know how to handle it, we simply say to each other, let's not have our religious differences deter us from working shoulder to shoulder here to rid our country of the conspiracy that means to destroy religion for all of us. Well, late 1958, Robert Welsh now had his thoughts all in order, and he sat down and he wrote out the founding meeting of the John Birch Society. He invited 15 men to visit with him for 2 full days in Indianapolis to listen to what he had to say. He didn't really tell them exactly what, other than that it was important. 11 accepted the invitation, and they visited with him for 2 days, December 8th and 9th of 1959. Robert Welsh talked to them for 17 hours. And what he said to them is the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. The Blue Book of the John Birch Society is nothing more than the transcript of that founding meeting. Of course, it's still available today, and we encourage anybody to read it because we haven't deterred at all from its wisdom. We're still the same John Birch Society as we were when we were founded in 1958. And at the end of that founding meeting, where Robert Welsh had talked about the problems of communism and collectivism and loss of faith, the great problem that comes when so many people turn away from their religious values and the moral codes of history and who work simply to promote themselves. They become greatly useful by a conspiracy that wishes to destroy everything. Well, at the end of the founding meeting, after he'd gone through and discussed the solutions to these problems and the political sense of Robert Welsh and the economic values and even bared his own soul religiously, which he didn't have to do, and of course you don't have to agree with his interpretation of religion. He gave us the nuts and bolts for the society. He asked the men there to help him. A man named Ben McMillan from St. Louis wrote out a check and reached over and handed it to Robert Welsh and said, "I guess we're in business, Bob. Let's go." And the John Birch Society was born. Now, an interesting sidelight is that that meeting was held at the home of a spinster woman named Marguerite Dice, who lived in Indianapolis, and she had been a friend of Robert Welsh only through correspondence. When he decided to hold the meeting in Indianapolis, because it was centrally located for the people he was inviting, he wrote ahead to Marguerite Dice and he asked her to recommend a place to hold the meeting. And she wrote back very quickly and said, "No better place than my home. You'll be perfectly private here. No one will disturb you. I'll be able to serve sandwiches and coffee if you'd like." Robert Welsh took her up on it, and the meeting was held at her private home right there in Indianapolis. Now, as you might expect, Marguerite Dice did what any of us would have done, of course. She sat on a camp chair right outside her own living room and listened to the entire meeting. And after it was over and the men had gone home, she had a chance to tell Robert Welsh what she thought. And she said, "Robert Welsh, that was magnificent. That was very impressive. The amount of background and research and documentation and everything that you've put into that effort is stupendous." But she said, "It won't work. It can't possibly succeed. The American people will never sit still for that amount of thoroughness." And she took out of her pocket or her purse a sheet of paper that looked something like this, where it was printed from left to right and from top to bottom, and there were underlinings and there were marginal notes and there were arrows and so forth. Not exactly this, but this something like this. And Robert Welsh took a look at it, and it hurt his eyes as it would hurt your eyes. And the chances of you reading that very slim indeed. She said, this is what the American people will stand still for and read. And Robert Welch has been absolutely opposed to this approach always in the history of the John Birch Society. He has said that the background and the importance of historical perspective cannot be overlooked. And so he thanked Marguerite Dice, and he said, I think I'll give it a try my way, which is certainly what he did. Now, the John Birch Society is committed to that. And of course, that means that there are some people who won't get involved with this because they don't want to take the time to learn. Well, if they don't take the time to learn, then they're not going to be of any value anyway. We encourage people to do the study. And the things that we publish are first class. They look good. They have eye appeal. We have always taken that route. It has cost more, but it has made a tremendous difference, as has the thoroughness in the documentation. It was about 10 years later that Robert Welch got a letter from Indianapolis from Miss Dice with an application blank for membership and a check for a year's dues and a little note that said, I guess you were right, do you still have room for me? And she became a member of the John Birch Society, and of course a good member until she died. Well, Robert Welch took his two-day speech on the road at that point, and all the early members of the John Birch Society came in from listening to Robert Welch in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in New York, in Boston, and other places for 2 full days. He was finally then persuaded to pare it down to 1 day. The Blue Book was printed. He was put on film, a portion of what he said, and the John Birch Society began to grow and to attract new people and to form chapters in this state and that state. And actually, in the first few years, had a couple of little victories when the letter-writing campaign of the John Birch Society members persuaded United Airlines not to put the United Nations symbol on their airplanes. And then another letter-writing campaign persuaded department stores around New York City not to convert Easter into a pagan fertility rite and to try to retain the essential religious values of the Easter celebration. Well, somebody noticed this. Somewhere along the line, the John Birch Society became of concern to the people who are opposed to what the John Birch Society stood for. And then the John Birch Society began to be attacked. The attack actually began with the publication of an article in a communist newspaper on the West Coast. That newspaper is called The People's World. February 25th of 1961, you can see the headline probably. It says, Enter from stage right, the John Birch Society. And went on to talk about this new secret fascist organization that was being started by a retired candy maker from Massachusetts, and that they were setting up cells all over the United States. It went on to talk about the fact that Robert Welch had called democracy a deceptive phrase, a weapon of demagoguery, and a perennial fraud. And you know, that's true. He did say that. But that's not all he said. He was describing our country as a republic. We, of course, pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. And Robert Welch, in a long speech, discussed our founding fathers' very, very severe attitude about democracy and why they gave us a republic instead. And he had written a long speech on the subject and delivered it many times, called Republics and Democracies. And in it, he talked about the value of a republic, the danger of a democracy, and the communist quote is accurate, but it's only half of the truth. It's a classic half-truth, in fact. A half-truth is a lie. Let me give you an example of another very classic half-truth. You'll get an impression of what we mean here. There are people who could come to you and say that the Holy Scripture itself says there is no God. And you know that's true. It does say that. But the whole sentence is, the fool in his heart hath said there is no God. And so you can see what you can do if you tell half the story. Well, that half-truth was used. You go to an American who didn't understand that our country was a republic and tell him that this man had condemned democracy, and he would begin immediately to fear the John Birch Society and to fear Robert Welch. That was done to a fare thee well. The article went on and talked about the fact that Robert Welch had called Dwight David Eisenhower a dedicated, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. That's fairly sensational too, isn't it? Well, what did he really say there? Let me return to that. I want to talk about something else first, and I will get back to that because it is so important. Well, the John Birch Society, all of a sudden, because the communists had started it, began to be attacked everywhere in the country. Newspapers, magazines, radio and television, all kinds of attention, and all of these individuals repeating errors of fact that had appeared in the communist article. Traceable to the communists, no other way, or the same source that the communists got it. The errors of fact were being repeated again and again. Robert Welch said, well, let's see if we can't get the government to investigate us. The House Committee on Un-American Activities said we had no cause to do so. The FBI said the same thing. We have no cause to investigate the John Birch Society. But out in California, Governor Pat Brown, the man who's the father of another man who became governor there, Jerry Brown, a left-wing Democrat, publicly stated that the John Birch Society ought to be investigated. Friends of Robert Welch sent him newspaper clippings about that. He cabled right across the country to Governor Brown and said, fine, when do you want me to appear? And he released it to the press. In other words, he called the bluff. And so the California government decided to investigate the John Birch Society. It was turned over to the California State Senate Fact-Finding Committee on Un-American Activities. And that group took 2 full years to investigate the society. Robert Welch went to California and talked to them and answered all their questions. And they hired people to go and join the John Birch Society, some of them covertly, to find out what really goes on at those chapter meetings. And some of those people stayed on as members after their assignment. They read all our books. They talked to our staff people. They went to our American Opinion bookstores. And finally, after 2 years, a Democrat-controlled state senate in California showed that the spirit of honesty and fair play still exists in America. When they published a 62-page report that completely exonerated us from all of the charges against us. The report ended up by saying that the John Birch Society had been accused of being secret, fascist, subversive, un-American, and anti-Semitic. We have not found any of those accusations to be supported by the evidence. The report was so honest, we asked for and got permission to publish it ourselves from that California State Senate group. We eventually did publish the California report on the John Birch Society. And whenever anybody attacked us or wanted to know what really the society was all about, we said, well, here's somebody else who has taken the time to look into what we are. But the attacks continued. Tens of thousands of copies of that California report were in fact published, and many people were able to read it. It went into, of course, the business of the democracy versus republic argument. That speech of Robert Welch is one of the many speeches that he's given in a volume called The New Americanism, reprinting his speeches and essays, and I certainly recommend that. Republics and Democracies and More Stately Mansions and Through All the Days to Be and the New Americanism speech itself. Those were very important speeches, and we encourage people to read them. But the attack upon the John Birch Society continued, and more. It reached a crescendo in 1964 at the Republican National Convention in California when Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York gave his famous speech against extremism, and he said that the country had to be rid of extremist groups like the communists, the Klan, the Nazis, and the John Birch Society. And he was booed by the delegates. And so he said it again, and he was booed again. There are many Americans today who still, when you say John Birch Society to them, will say, well, isn't that like the Klan, or like the communists, or like the Nazis? And of course, there's no truth at all to that. There's no stronger opponent of the Klan and the Nazis and the communists than the John Birch Society. Now, all during this period, of course, what Robert Welch had said about Dwight David Eisenhower was being repeated. Only a portion of it again. Robert Welch actually had begun to study Dwight Eisenhower back in 1952. And by 1954, he'd begun to study him more, because during the 1954 congressional elections, Robert Welch and a friend had noticed that a lot of the men that they would love to have seen elected to Senate and to House seats had built a whole campaign upon a promised visit of the president during a critical moment of that campaign. And of course, that would have been a very good stimulus to get people to vote for this particular man. And that in case after case, the president had canceled at the 11th hour. And Robert Welch told his friend in New York that He believed that it was done deliberately because he'd studied Dwight Eisenhower and he didn't like what he'd found. And the man said, well, what have you found? And Robert Welch said, well, I've got a lot of information back in my office. Let me go home and I'll write you a letter about it. Well, he did, and he wrote a letter to the man of 65 pages in length. And that 65-page letter has been added to as more information became known to Robert Welch. It eventually became a 300-page book. That 300-page book eventually published, called The Politician, about Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, what did he find? What was so startling? Well, certainly we can't go into the whole 300 pages, but let's simply mention a couple of items here. At the end of World War II, as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Eisenhower had ordered the forcible repatriation of somewhere between 2 and 5 million refugees from communism who had fled during the turmoil of the war from Eastern Europe, from Russia itself. People slashing their wrists, trying to commit suicide, rather than to be loaded on boxcars and sent back to certain death and slavery. The operation, called Operation Keelhaul, about the reminiscent of the famous torture of sea, given by the captains of sea vessels to their crew. There were many of the American military men who just couldn't understand why we were doing this. And I've met repeatedly throughout the country men who participated in that and never did understand it. It was one of the most horrible crimes in all history, directly traceable to Eisenhower and him alone. And after he left military service, he became the head of Columbia University in New York City, and then immediately removed from the faculty. Knowledgeable Eastern European anti-communists welcomed a communist delegation from Poland to set up studies at Columbia University. His own book on that World War II was called Crusade in Europe. And that book was ghostwritten for him by a man named Joseph Fells Barnes, who was known to be a communist at the time. Now, all of this and much more, of course. And Robert Welch finally, in the late 1950s, printed up about 200 copies of this manuscript, and he'd give them to people he thought could understand it and handle it. And he asked them not to share it with anybody and to return it as soon as they were finished with their thoughts. And a lot of the people who wrote back to him said, "You've got to publish this." Others who wrote back to him said, "It's too hot. You can't publish it." Nobody could find anything wrong. By that time, of course, the information about the betrayal of the Hungarian Revolution by the Eisenhower administration, and then the welcoming and the helping of Castro to take over Cuba when they knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that he was indeed a communist. That was in The Politician now. Well, one of the people who read the book found that it had been stolen from him. It eventually worked its way into the hands of a wise guy reporter in Chicago, and then into the hands of the communists. At the end of this book, Robert Welch had said, if the history is disturbing to both the reader and myself, please don't blame him who wrote it, blame him who made it. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know how to explain this other than to suggest 3 possible alternatives: that he was either stupid, or he was a willing opportunist, or he was a conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. The third of the 3 alternatives, of course, is the only thing that was ever told the American people. I couldn't recommend a book more highly to understand the history of the last 40 years in our country, and I'll be perfectly willing to tell you that it's a horrible book, but it's so important. So we recommend The Politician by Robert Welch as well. For 2 solid years, Robert Welch and the John Birch Society took it on the chin about The Politician. And then in 1963, he published the book. And he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times to announce the publication of his book about General Eisenhower. And he made copies of it himself. And he sent that ad to bookstores all across the United States, offering them discounts that they could buy it from him at a reduced price and sell it at full retail value, as bookstores certainly like to do. He got very few orders. The heat was so intense. A friend of mine who worked for the John Birch Society at the time went down to the Harvard Coop, the bookstore. It's called the Harvard Cooperative Society, right in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right near Harvard University. It's probably the bookstore that sold the most books of any bookstore in the United States then, and maybe even now. And he went in and he went to the purchasing department and he showed them Robert Welch's new book on Eisenhower, and the man said, "Oh, can we sell those? How do they come?" 24 in a case. He said, "Well, fine, we'll take 5 cases." My friend asked for a purchase order and he was told that had to come back and get one of the bosses to sign something for that much. So he came back after lunch and the boss said, "We'll take 5. My friend said, "You mean 5 cases?" He said, "No, I said 5, and if you don't want to sell 5, that's okay too." They bought 5. They never put one on the shelf, and to this day have never sold a copy of that book, nor any other book that the John Birch Society has ever published. And we dare call it a conspiracy. Well, the society is going along here and getting attacked repeatedly, over and over again. At the peak of the attack on the society, there were about 1,000 mentions of us in a single week in newspapers and magazines and radio and television. And it began to have a reverse effect. Curiosity. Many people said, "Let's take a look at what the John Birch Society has to say." And they came, and they bought our books, and they joined the society. Our growth had its strongest period during the time that we were being so heavily attacked. There were other people who probably responded as I did to the John Birch Society. I remember the good nuns back in Brooklyn, New York, teaching me that the Nazi government had told the people in Germany what it intended to do because Hitler had written a book, but nobody had read the book. The sisters told me, when I heard about this horrible John Birch Society, one of my responses was, "I better read their book." And so I did. And you can now know what happened to me, as has happened to so many people who've taken the time to study the John Birch Society. Well, all of a sudden, in '65, it was as if somebody had pulled a cork out of the bathtub and all the water ran out. Overnight, the attacks ceased, and we were no longer being mentioned. And then it became very, very difficult for the society to reach out and to get other people interested in what we were saying and doing. It was as if the John Birch Society had been found out to be so bad that they had pretty much gone underground in the minds of the American people. We reached a period of doldrums in that time, and I heard Robert Welch years later tell a group that the John Birch Society reached its Valley Forge in the summer of 1966. And I gulped, because later on that evening I told him I was interested in his comment about Valley Forge because I joined his staff on August 1st of 1966. And he looked at me and laughed, and he said, "I told you it was our Valley Forge." And he was always kidding. And it used to frustrate me to see him during meetings when there was heavy discussion going on, to stop and to go off on a tangent and tell a story or try to get a laugh out of us and so forth. I was very busy and very intense, and I later recognized the brilliance of that man in taking time for a little bit of humor. And I try to do it myself, although I'm not as good at it as he was. Well, the John Birch Society couldn't reach out anymore. It was really troublesome getting new people interested. And so then we started our ad hoc committee programs, and we got people involved in a portion of what we did. We started the TACT committees, Truth About Civil Turmoil, TACT, and Support Your Local Police committees. And then the TRAIN committees, TRAIN, to Restore American Independence Now. And a lot of people came and joined our ad hoc committees. We told them all, of course, that it was part of the John Birch Society's operations. But we didn't ask them to join the society or subscribe to everything that the society had said. And a lot of people who were concerned because America's cities were going up in smoke and our boys were being slain over in Vietnam, hundreds per week. And so we began to get a lot more activity amongst the members that we had, and it led to more people joining the society. Well, our society continued then. In 1966, something else significant happened. Robert Welch published an essay called The Truth in Time. And in that essay, there was one sentence that was perhaps the most profound sentence I had ever read. Other than some verses in Scripture that I love, this little sentence said simply, "But communism is only a tool of a larger conspiracy." That made more sense to me than anything I had read about this whole problem we were facing. You see, I had read Whittaker Chambers' book and Elizabeth Bentley's book. These two prominent ex-communists had both broken from communism and written books to try to warn the American people and to help them to understand what communism was and what it was doing to our country. And in the course of their books, each of them told about being assigned by their superiors within the Communist Party to move to a different community and to take on a new identity and to deny that they'd ever been a part of the communist movement, and even to shun their comrades if they should ever come in contact with them, and to become far more valuable as somebody who was not known to be a communist. In other words, to go underground. And I knew that there were problems in our government. I had no use at all for Robert McNamara. I had no use at all for Dean Rusk and several other high officials of our government, and it occurred to me that maybe these men were underground communists. But Robert Welsh was now telling us that there was a movement above communism. He called them the insiders, these people who were involved in a conspiracy that predated communism, the people who financed Karl Marx, and the people who brought into power communism and socialism and Nazism and fascism and other isms. In 1917, of course, one of their children, one of their arms, communism, had seized control of a nation. And communism rose to a very preeminent position within the conspiracy. The conspiracy became known as the Communist Conspiracy. But Robert Welsh said it's important to realize that communism is only one arm of a larger group above, run by people who themselves have never been communists. These are the people who dignify communism, who help the communists, who get the government of the United States to supply the communists. He coined the term for them, the insiders, which of course is why my little book is called The Insiders, to describe the people who are not communists, but who use communism, who finance it, who dignify it, and so forth. That made more sense to me than anything else. And I think it will make sense to you, too, if you will take a chance and read the John Birch Society's attitude about this conspiracy above communism. Well, the Society's moving along and doing well and piling up its victories here and there. And in 1983, in March, the Society's leadership decided that because Robert Welsh was getting on in years and beginning to fail in health, to make a change at the top of the Society. And the chairman of the Society was named Dr. Larry McDonald, a longtime member of the John Birch Society who had already served 4 terms in Congress, the only member of the John Birch Society in Congress at the time. And president was named Thomas N. Hill, Mr. Welsh's right-hand man, in Belmont, Massachusetts, for better than 20 years. Robert Welsh himself was named chairman emeritus. And so we had a new leadership, and the Society continued and was doing quite well. In September of 1983, Congressman Larry McDonald, the chairman of the John Birch Society, was murdered when the Soviet fighter pilot shot down Korean airliner 007 over the Sea of Japan. Newspaper reporters, of course, called us and said, well, what do you do now? You're leaderless. And I said, no, we're not leaderless. You missed this story as well. We have a president, Thomas Hill, and he's right here. And in time, of course, the John Birch Society has named an industrialist from Virginia who was a longtime member of our council, a man named Clifford Barker, to be our chairman, and the John Birch Society continues. Now, what's interesting about that is that from 1965 until the death of Dr. McDonald, the Society enjoyed no national attention whatsoever, good, bad, or indifferent. But the attention did come during that period, and it led to a tremendous surge of interest in the Society, new membership, new activity of our members. We had the best 6 months in recruiting after the death of Dr. McDonald that we'd had in the last 10 years. Which says to me, of course, that the chances of us getting any national attention are very slim indeed, because the people who give us that attention are not the people who want us to succeed. Now, you have a right to ask at this point, what is the real strategy of the John Birch Society, and does it work? Well, let me comment very briefly about that. The strategy of the John Birch Society is majestically simple. The strategy simply says, create awareness, and then that awareness will be reflected in the way the people vote. We're not going to tell anybody for whom to vote. We're not going to back candidates. We're not a political organization. We just simply intend to create the awareness. And so that program is majestically simple. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it is simple. The essence of brilliance is simplicity. And so you might ask yourself at this point, well, does it work? And ladies and gentlemen, it does work. You can ask several ex-senators, in fact, more than a dozen. Ex-Senator Birch from Indiana, ex-Senators Clark and Culver from Iowa, ex-Senator Morgan from North Carolina, and Javits from New York, McIntyre from New Hampshire, Haskell and McGee from the Rocky Mountain states. If he wasn't already deceased, Frank Church from Idaho, Gravel from Alaska. All those individuals suffered because the John Birch Society educated quite a few people in their state about what was happening, and even put out a little backgrounder about these men and how they had conducted themselves in the United States Senate. And several of them blamed the John Birch Society by name for their defeat. You could ask as many as a score of ex-congressmen who have been victimized, I guess you could say, by our trim bulletins when our trim committees throughout the country published the voting record of the congressman. Did he vote for higher taxes and more government, or did he vote for lower taxes and less government? And for the first time in their lives, millions of Americans find out what their congressman is really doing, not what he says when he comes home and he sounds just wonderful. What is he actually voting for in Washington? And many of those ex-congressmen blamed the John Birch Society's trim committees for their defeat. And our program works not only in the political results and fallout that it generates, but also it works on issues. The Equal Rights Amendment people, promoting that, know fully that the John Birch Society had a major role in defeating the Equal Rights Amendment. The American Indian movement, those who want sex education in every school in America, knew that the John Birch Society stopped it cold when it looked like they were in fact going to have sex education in all of the schools of America. So our program works. And what we need to make it work even more is more membership, more muscle, more motivation, and certainly more resources. And that might be where you come in. What about yourself? Are you concerned about the future? Do you understand that your country is being converted into a carbon copy of a communist state? The Communist Manifesto lists 10 planks. Every single one of them is partially or fully in place in America today, and it all happened in the 20th century. Well, the John Birch Society, to its members, always says, stand tall and be proud, but don't rest on your laurels. Continue to work hard. Continue to help us to reach out to others. And to those of you in audiences wherever this videotape is shown, wherever I speak, I give you a very sincere invitation to join the John Birch Society, and to do it this very evening. The John Birch Society is close to 50,000 members. If we could double that number and then double it again, in other words, close to 200,000 members, there is no force on God's earth that could stop us from restoring our country with less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. And so we ask you to accept that responsibility and to help us to return this world gone crazy to sanity once again. And let me close this meeting as Robert Welsh had often closed so many of his meetings over the years that he gave, so many of those meetings, where he simply said to those who were not yet members of the John Birch Society to come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. Thank you very much.